So if you've ever stood on the sidelines of a youth soccer game, specifically around that under 13 or under 14 level, you've probably seen this exact scenario play out.
Oh, absolutely. The size difference is just wild.
Right. It's like you have one kid who looks like they already have a mortgage and a 401k, and they're playing right next to a kid who still looks like they belong in elementary school.
Yeah, and the calendar says they are both the exact same age.
Exactly. But your eyes are telling you that biology completely disagrees with the calendar.
Because biology is just ignoring the calendar entirely.
Yeah.
You are essentially watching two completely different developmental stages colliding on the exact same pitch.
Which perfectly sets up what we're getting into today. Welcome to this deep dive. Today we are exploring a 2026 systematic review that essentially proves the traditional calendar we use to organize youth sports is, well, it's actively lying to us about who actually has athletic talent.
It really is. It's a huge flaw in the system.
To do this with strict scientific clarity, we are unpacking an incredibly rigorous piece of academic literature. It's titled "The Effect of Biobanding on Talent Identification in Youth Soccer: A Systematic Review."
Right. Published in the Journal of Sports Science and Medicine, Volume 25.
Exactly. Authored by Chaojie Han, Nan Luo, Zhiwei Zhao, and Dewey Mu. And our mission today is to analyze this review and explore whether the traditional way we categorize young athletes by exact chronological birth year is creating a massive systemic selection bias.
And we are going to look at how a concept called biobanding might actually be the scientific mechanism we need to correct this.
Let's start with the hard data from the paper because, the numbers here are just wild.
They really are.
There is this glaring example they cite regarding an English youth soccer academy. When they looked at the players who were actually selected for the elite squads, they found that 54.8% of those youth players were born in the first quarter of the year.
Yeah, so over half the team was born in January, February, or March.
Which is insane.
The mathematical improbability of that occurring naturally is just staggering. It really highlights a phenomenon known as the relative age effect.
Right, the older kids in the grade year just dominating.
Exactly. But the review goes even further into actual biological maturity. In that same academy, they looked at the under 15 and under 16 groups, and the number of players classified as late maturing was 0.
Wait, 0?
Not a few. Literally 0.
Wow. Okay, let's unpack this. I like to think of it like, imagine judging two completely different species of plants by the exact same calendar week, rather than looking at their respective growth stages.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. Like, we are essentially punishing the late bloomers simply because their internal biological clock hasn't triggered their growth spurt yet.
Yeah, you are putting a middleweight boxer in the ring with a heavyweight.
Yes. Yeah.
But you're telling the middleweight they have to win using only technique, while the heavyweight is allowed to just lean on them and push them around.
Because the calendar says they are both 14, so it's supposedly a fair fight.
Right. But biology says it's a completely unfair matchup. The middleweight is going to get crushed before we ever find out if they actually have good boxing technique.
So what does the review say about the actual consequences of this trap?
Well, the chronological trap cascades into a twofold consequence for talent identification. First, it completely compromises fairness of opportunity.
Because the late maturers are just physically smaller and lighter.
Exactly. So they get significantly less playing time, they get fewer touches on the ball in high-pressure situations, and they are marginalized in competitive scenarios.
They are essentially starved of the developmental oxygen they need to improve.
Yeah, if you aren't getting minutes on the pitch, you aren't developing your game. You are just watching other kids get better.
So that's the opportunity side. What's the second consequence?
The second consequence is that it destroys the validity of how coaches evaluate talent.
Okay, how so?
The review shows that coaches and scouts systematically mistake early physical size, raw speed, and sheer power for actual technical soccer skill.
Oh, I see. So an early maturing player might just be kicking the ball far and outrunning everyone to it.
Exactly. That isn't elite tactical awareness. That's just, an early puberty growth spurt.
But the coach writes down on their clipboard that the kid is a phenom.
Right. And meanwhile, this leads to the premature deselection of the late developers.
The kids who might actually possess far superior cognitive processing or spatial awareness.
Exactly. Or elite technical footwork. But because they're just waiting for their physical bodies to catch up, they just get cut from the academy at age 14.
So since judging kids by their birth year creates this heavily skewed selection bias, we have to look at the proposed intervention from the paper.
Right, the biobanding intervention.
Mechanically, how do we actually do this? Because it sounds like a logistical nightmare.
Well, biobanding is an intervention designed to categorize adolescent players by their biological maturation stage rather than their exact chronological age.
Okay, so we're looking at specific age groups here.
Yeah, the review specifically targets players aged 18 years and under, because this encompasses that critical window of the adolescent growth spurt.
Which the literature calls peak height velocity, or PHV, right?
Yes, exactly. PHV is the period where the discrepancy between a kid's chronological age and their biological reality is at its absolute most extreme.
So instead of having an under 14 team, an academy would field an under 85% of adult height team.
In practice, yeah, that's basically it.
But how do they figure that out? They aren't taking skeletal x-rays of every teenager, are they?
No, that would be incredibly expensive and just impractical. Instead, researchers and academies are utilizing non-invasive estimation methods.
Okay, so predictive math.
Right. They use specific measurements to calculate the percentage of predicted adult height. And the most common tool mentioned in the review is the Camis-Roche method.
Okay, wait, let's break that down for a second, because anytime we talk about predictive math for kids, it raises some red flags for me.
Sure, that's fair.
From my understanding of the text, the Camis-Roche method takes the child's current height, current weight, and the mid-parental height, meaning how tall their biological parents are.
Yes, that's the formula.
And you plug that into an algorithm, and it spits out an estimate of how tall that kid will eventually be.
Exactly. And therefore, it tells you what percentage of their final growth they've currently completed.
So you are trying to group players who are at the exact same biological stage, say 85 to 90% of their final predicted height.
Right, you're matching them based on where they are in their physical journey, not how many months they've been alive.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, but also a bit murky.
How so?
If we are estimating adult height or peak growth without invasive skeletal scans, just relying on a formula that assumes a kid will follow a standard growth curve based on their parents, isn't there a massive risk of misclassification?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, genetics can be incredibly unpredictable. We are relying on predictive algorithms to potentially determine a kid's athletic future.
Yeah, and the systematic review explicitly acknowledges this inherent uncertainty. Using non-invasive proxies carries a documented risk of misclassification.
So some kids will definitely end up in the wrong group.
Some players will inevitably be placed in a band slightly above or below their true biological stage. Yes. But the theoretical goal of biobanding isn't to create a flawless, utopian biological sorting system.
So if we accept that the math isn't perfect, the goal isn't absolute scientific precision. It sounds like the goal is simply to break the physical monopoly.
That is the objective. By grouping players by physical maturity rather than age, you drastically reduce the physical dominance of the early matures.
You shift the competitive constraints.
Exactly. Suddenly, a biologically advanced 14-year-old can't just bully a smaller player off the ball.
Because the kid defending them is now exactly their size.
Right. They are forced to rely on technical proficiency, spatial awareness, and tactical decision-making to succeed.
Okay, so now that we understand the theory and the math behind how this works, we have to transition to the actual data.
Right, what actually happens on the pitch.
Exactly. What happens to the physiological and technical realities when you level this biological playing field?
Well, the physiological shifts are fascinating because they are highly context-dependent. They aren't just uniformly positive or negative across all formats of the game.
Meaning it depends on if they are playing on a small field versus a full field.
Exactly. For example, in small-sided games, think 4-on-4 or 6-on-6 matches on a reduced pitch, the data shows that biobanding actually attenuates overall physical load and acute neuromuscular fatigue.
So the matches actually become less physiologically draining for the group as a whole?
Yes.
Which makes sense. I mean, if everyone is the same size, you don't have massive collisions between a 150-pound kid and a 90-pound kid. The physical toll of the impact is just lower.
But soccer isn't only played in small spaces.
Right. So what happens when they move to the big pitch?
When you scale up to larger or full-sided 11 versus 11 games, the dynamic completely flips. The more mature players suddenly experience significantly greater high-intensity demands.
So the big kids actually have to work harder.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the less mature players experience higher external workloads, meaning they are running more total distance and tracking faster sprint speeds, but without a corresponding spike in internal physiological strain.
Wait, I want to focus on that detail because it's crucial.
It really is.
Why would a late maturing kid suddenly be running faster and further, but not feeling as exhausted internally, like their heart rate isn't spiking.
Right. If you think about the physics and psychology of the pitch, in a normal chronological game, that small late maturer is probably terrified of getting crushed.
Oh, for sure. They are bracing for impact, playing conservatively, maybe even hiding on the periphery of the action.
Exactly. But in a bio-banded game against kids their own size, that fear is basically gone.
They're finally running into open space, making overlapping runs, and expressing themselves physically without the internal stress of impending doom.
Yeah, the spatial exploration behavior changes entirely. And this brings us to the technical and tactical changes documented in the review.
Right, how does the actual gameplay change?
Match involvement is completely redistributed across the entire team. The data shows increases in the frequency of duels and set pieces, and a notable decrease in average possession time per action.
And the passes actually get shorter, right?
Yes, passes get shorter.
I like to view this as removing the easy button for those early maturers.
That's a great analogy.
If you're the big, fast kid in a standard age group game, your stride length is huge. Your team can just lob a 30-yard pass over the top of the defense, and you will outrun everyone to it.
Which requires basically zero tactical thought.
Right. But when bio-banding puts you against defenders who are just as fast and just as big as you are, that 30-yard lob doesn't work anymore. The defender intercepts it.
Which physically forces that early maturer to adapt. They can no longer outmuscle or outstride the opponent.
They have to rely on 5-yard possession passes and tight footwork.
Exactly. And cognitive processing to move the ball up the pitch. They are finally being challenged to learn the actual game of soccer.
And what about the late developers? The kids who used to play one-touch soccer just to avoid getting tackled by the heavyweights.
The review shows that in bio-banded games, those late developers suddenly demonstrate much greater engagement in defensive and ball-winning actions.
Wow.
Yeah, we see a quantifiable increase in tackles, ball recoveries, and attacking ball actions from them.
These are critical soccer behaviors that were previously completely suppressed.
Because they simply didn't have the physics on their side to attempt a tackle before.
It's like unearthing a completely hidden skill set.
It really is.
And reading through the systematic review, the physical and technical changes make total sense. But the authors reveal that changing this physical environment drastically alters the mental environment, too.
Yes, and that psychological shift might be the absolute most valuable data point for talent identification.
So what are the psychological outcomes here?
They are incredibly compelling. The researchers found that late maturers demonstrated a marked increase in positive attitude, confidence, and overall competitiveness when they were placed in these bio-banded games.
The imposter syndrome essentially lifts.
Exactly. They felt they could finally compete on equal footing, which drastically improved their self-esteem within the sport.
Which has to be massive for simply keeping kids in the sport, right? Like, if a kid feels completely overwhelmed every weekend because of their size, they're just going to quit.
Right? Bio-banding gives them a window where they actually enjoy the game, which prevents that premature deselection we talked about earlier. It creates a sort of protective psychological bubble.
But wait, I need to push back here a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
Just because a smaller player suddenly feels more confident and makes more tackles in a bio-banded game, does that actually prove they have elite long-term potential? Or does it just prove we made the game easier for them for an afternoon?
That is a critical distinction, and one drawn directly from the academic synthesis. Bio-banding creates better observation conditions for coaches and scouts. It does not automatically mean it is improving identification accuracy.
Right. Just because a kid looks like a superstar when you remove the giant defenders doesn't mean they will be a superstar when they reach adulthood and everyone is giant again.
Exactly. It unmasks psychological qualities like bravery and leadership that are relevant to long-term development. But the authors highlight that we have to interpret that data with extreme caution.
Because favorable behavior in a highly specific altered context doesn't necessarily equal stable long-term talent.
The review heavily warns against making that automatic assumption. Context sensitivity is a major part of the bio-banding phenomenon.
And not every single player felt the exact same psychological boost, right?
Correct. In fact, the findings on perceived effort and psychological exertion were quite inconsistent across the different studies included in the review.
Meaning we can't assume a uniform psychological experience for all players involved?
Right. For some late maturers, being expected to suddenly lead the team and win tackles because they are no longer the smallest might actually induce more anxiety.
Oh, that makes sense. The pressure is suddenly on them.
Exactly. The psychological benefit is a general trend in the data, not an absolute, guaranteed rule for every individual child.
And because we don't yet know if these short-term behavioral shifts actually translate to professional contracts 5 or 10 years down the road, we have to look really closely at the study's limitations.
We do. We have to look at the methodology.
Right, because we are basing all these fascinating insights about spatial awareness and psychology on the data synthesized in this specific paper. So what exactly is the scope of the data pool here?
Well, the systematic review synthesized 13 quasi-experimental studies encompassing a total of 861 participants.
Okay, 861 kids.
Yes. And using standard academic metrics for study reliability, specifically the Qualys scoring tool, the overall methodological quality was a solid 0.85 out of 1.0.
Which indicates very good overall study quality.
It does. But when you dig into the specific domains of how these studies were conducted, there are some glaring limitations.
What are the biggest red flags for you?
First, there is a widespread lack of randomization in how players were assigned.
Okay.
There's a lack of blinding for the outcome assessors, meaning the coaches evaluating the players often knew they were in a bio-banded game, which introduces observational bias.
Of course. They expect to see changes, so they see them.
Exactly. There's also an inability to control for confounding variables, like a coach's specific tactical instructions on that given day.
That makes the data a bit messy.
It does. Furthermore, and this is perhaps the most significant flaw, 99.8% of the participants in these 13 studies were male.
Wait, 99.8%?
Yes, only 2 female participants were included in the entire synthesized dataset.
That is just a staggering blind spot for the scientific community.
It really is.
You absolutely cannot claim to have a comprehensive, systemic understanding of biological maturation in youth sports when you are actively ignoring half the global population.
No, you can't.
Female athletes go through entirely different physiological growth curves and peak height velocity timelines than male athletes.
It is a profound limitation of the current literature. The missing link right now is that the evidence relies almost entirely on short-term match responses and proxy outcomes.
Like just counting the number of short passes in a single weekend tournament.
Right. We simply do not have direct longitudinal evidence, yet showing improved long-term selection accuracy or definitive career success directly attributable to biobanding.
This highlights a massive call to action for sports scientists. Researchers need to agree on shared, standardized outcomes that capture how players contribute to the game cognitively and technically over time, not just how much distance they run on a given Saturday.
Absolutely.
And it is absolutely critical that they test these models rigorously on female athletes to see if the biological markers and behavioral shifts track in the same way.
We need longitudinal studies that follow these athletes from their first bio-banded tournament at age 13, all the way to the professional draft at age 18 or 21.
Because that longitudinal tracking is the only way to prove if biobanding can evolve from being a fascinating observational tool into a foundational, scientifically validated pillar of global talent identification.
Exactly. Until then, it remains a highly promising, yet incomplete intervention.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the mechanics of youth sports, I want to leave you with a thought that builds on the underlying science we've discussed today.
I love where this is going.
If leveling the biological playing field unmasks hidden psychological and tactical brilliance in physical late bloomers on the soccer pitch, what would happen if we applied this exact same biobanding philosophy to our educational systems?
Oh, wow.
Right. What if classrooms were grouped by cognitive developmental stages and executive function maturity rather than strictly by their birth year?
That is a fascinating idea.
Would we suddenly unmask a whole generation of academic late bloomers who are currently getting left behind by the rigid expectations of the chronological trap?
It's a total paradigm shift. It challenges everything about how we organize childhood. I mean, how many gifted minds or gifted athletes are we currently sidelining simply because their internal clocks didn't perfectly align with a calendar on a wall?
It makes you rethink every system we use to measure potential.
It really does.
To truly grasp the intricacies of this data, the specific statistical breakdowns, and the rigorous methodology behind the Camis-Roche applications we discussed, we highly encourage you to read the full article.
Yes, highly recommended.
Again, it is titled The Effect of Biobanding on Talent Identification in Youth Soccer, a systematic review by Han, Luo, Zhao, and Bu, published in the Journal of Sports Science and Medicine, Volume 25.
It's a great read.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration. Please remember to follow the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the fascinating world of sports science and beyond. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we'll see you